C-SPAN 2 programming information is available to our viewers 24 hours a day. For the latest schedule rundown, you may call 202-628-2205. That's current information about C-SPAN 2's live gavel-to-gavel coverage of the United States Senate and other public affairs events that provide an inside look at government in action.
Up next, we'll hear from the former U.S. Ambassador to Saudi Arabia, James Akins. He spoke last evening in Washington at the Georgetown University. His remarks focus on the current situation in the Persian Gulf, and Mr. Akins gives his perspectives on possible solutions to avoid war in the region.
Well, on behalf of the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies and Dr. Ibrahim, the acting director of the center, I would like to introduce a very distinguished guest who is speaking in our Gulf Watch lecture series. And because he is so distinguished and well known, he really doesn't need a long introduction. And because time is precious, I won't give a long introduction. But suffice it to say that Ambassador James Akins is very well known to all of us that have been following the Gulf crisis, if only for his frequent and informed commentary. Most recently, I think I caught him in the same evening, both on MacNeil-Lehrer and one of the other national news programs. And I kept wondering how he got from one studio to the other within the space of 15 minutes. It's technology, perhaps will answer that. He is indeed a specialist on the Arab world with many accomplishments to his credit. And among them, of course, is his diplomatic assignment as U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia between 1973 and 1975. But he has also served, and this is interesting, I think, for our discussion tonight, both in Iraq and in Kuwait, as well as in Beirut and Damascus. And in addition to that, is a specialist on Middle East energy and oil. He's going to speak to us tonight for he tells me approximately 45 minutes. His title is The U.S., the Arabian Peninsula, and the Resolution of the Kuwait Crisis. After Ambassador Akins has finished his formal remarks, we'll follow the usual custom and open the floor for your comments and questions, but we do need to adjourn by 7:30. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Ambassador James Akins.
Thanks. Throughout most of the last century and well into this century, war was considered romantic. And when war finally broke out in 1914, young men rushed to the front, looking for excitement and glory. But in the course of the war, it lost somewhat of its good name. And it was tarnished further between 1939 and 1945. And 45 years have now passed since the end of the Second World War, and we have, of course, had no wars. We have had skirmishes and revolts, and we've had punitive forays and police actions and civil disturbances, but no war. And today we talk only of exercising our military option on war. There's, of course, good reason for these semantic twistings. By our Constitution, Congress must declare war, and it's been notoriously reluctant to do so. The public's not so easily beguiled, however. It refers consistently to the Vietnam and to the Korean Wars. Grenada and Panama and Nicaragua may have thought that they were at war with us, but they were too insignificant to qualify as such in the American press or TV or even in the popular mind. Now, once again, we are clearly headed toward war. I'm sure it's not going to bear the label of war because Congress is not going to declare war. And it won't be as long or as difficult as the Second World War. The enemy's not a new Hitler. His country can scarcely aspire to ruling the world. But it's not going to be as quick, as easy as Grenada or even Panama. Nonetheless, I expect it will be over by next summer. It's quite short as wars go. There could be tens of thousands of Americans killed and hundreds of thousands of Arabs. The Arabs don't count, of course. We all know that they don't have the same respect for life that we have. General Dugan, the Chief of Staff of our Air Force, spoke of obliteration bombing of Iraqi cities in order, he said, to save casualties. In other words, a short, glorious war. Americans understood very well what he meant, and they generally approved. Saving American boys from death is noble. But the rest of the world also understood what he said, and their interpretation was quite different. Americans think only of their own. The lives of Asians and Africans weigh for little or nothing in the American balance. Is war really inevitable? Are we seeing an unfolding of a Greek tragedy where gods have set forces in motion that humans cannot alter? No, of course it's not like that. Before going into it, let's look exactly at what we're talking about. Who's the enemy? What does he want? What forces does he have on his side? Does he have the support of his own people? What were the reasons for his attack on Kuwait? Will he withdraw? Can we persuade him to do so, and if so, how? Kuwait is the best port in the Arab littoral of the Persian Gulf, but because it had no water, the port wasn't developed until fairly recently. While it was part of the Ottoman Empire, in the last century, the British saw the advantage of Kuwait's harbor, and in 1899 they established their footsteps toward a protectorate over the Sheikhdom. The Ottoman Empire did not resist. And after the First World War, when Iraq was given nominal independence under British tutelage, Faisal of the Hashemites became its first modern king, and he demanded Kuwait as the harbor for his new country. Basra on the Shatt al-Arab is some 80 miles from the Persian Gulf and can easily be cut off from the sea. The British refused. The Arab states in the Gulf were part of the British India office, and they were small, divided, easily ruled. And Iraq with a port in the Persian Gulf might eventually cause the British trouble. No, it was much better to keep Iraq a landlocked country. No Iraqi ruler was ever satisfied with this. The claims were renewed through the 20s and the 30s. Nouri Said pressed this, but all of the rulers of Iraq were in no position to challenge the British. It should have been noted that in the 1920s there was no hint of any oil in Kuwait. Oil wasn't discovered until the late 30s and wasn't exploited until after the war. In 1952, after the nationalization of oil in Iran, the British moved smoothly across the Gulf, developed Kuwait very rapidly, and for the next 10 years, Kuwait was the largest oil producer in the Middle East, larger than Saudi Arabia. And it became the first of the super wealthy states of the Middle East. In '61, the British terminated their protection agreement with Kuwait. They gave it its full independence and they withdrew. And the then dictator of Iraq, Abdul Qasim, announced that Kuwait, the usurped Kaaba, should be returned to Iraq, the Iraqi motherland. And in a rather bizarre move, he appointed the Sheikh of Kuwait the governor of the Iraqi province of Kuwait. The Sheikh, however, did not pick up his credentials, and he called the British back in, and the Iraqis didn't press their claim. In '63, Qasim was overthrown and killed. The leaders of the coup were Ba'athis, the same party, not the same individuals as rules Iraq today. And in October 1963, the new Iraqi government recognized Kuwait. It sent an ambassador to Kuwait, and indeed there was an ambassador there until the Iraqi invasion on the 2nd of August. This is the all-important point. Whatever the Iraqi claim, and there's no doubt about its antiquity, and whatever Iraqis think is just, and again, there's no doubt that every Iraqi, no matter what he thinks of Saddam Hussein, believes that Kuwait is rightfully part of Iraq. All of this is irrelevant. By any interpretation of international law, the old claims were superseded by the Iraqi recognition of Kuwait in the exchange of ambassadors. The northern boundary of Kuwait, however, was not demarcated, and it remains an important part of the problem. Iraq had good relations with the Shah, and his overthrow came as a blow to it, as it did to us, and to all the Arabs of the Gulf. Within 2 years of the revolution, the Islamic Republic was at war with Iraq. There are many Arabs, perhaps I should say the majority of Arabs, who believe that the United States enticed Saddam to attack Iran, knowing that he would fail. Iraq then would be bogged down for many years to come. I hear this accusation every time I go to the Persian Gulf, and I hear it from the very leaders who I know encouraged Saddam to attack Iran in 1980. But their memories are very selective. All of our memories, of course, are selective. And now when I talk to them, the story I get is, the ruler of X, warned Saddam not to do this, but he wouldn't listen to me, and now he's paying for his mistakes. The fact is, of course, that all Arabs, including the Iraqis, and not so incidentally, most Americans, were worried about the strength and the vitality of the Arabian Revolution and the possibility that it would sweep Iraq aside, and they had good reason. 55% of Iraq is Shia, and many, including most notably Khomeini himself, believed that they would join his Islamic Republic. The main Shia shrines are in Iraq. It's impossible to imagine a Shia Islamic Republic or a Shia empire which does not aspire to include Karbala and Najaf and Kufa. Khomeini had the utmost contempt for the Arab monarchs. His maps didn't show Saudi Arabia at all. It's marked Arabistan. Kuwait and the other small sheikdoms were dismissed as non-countries. If Baghdad had fallen, there's little doubt that the Arabian Peninsula would quickly have come under the sway of the mullahs. Khomeini said repeatedly that the fall of Baghdad is the first step toward the liberation of Mecca from the House of Saud and Jerusalem from the Zionists. Arab support of Saddam was not irrational, nor was our support of Saddam, insofar as we gave it to him. The Gulf Arabs underwrote Iraq to the tune of several scores of billions of dollars. When the war ended in 1988, Saddam claimed a victory, but his victories were of minimal importance. The most important accomplishment, he said, was the abrogation of the humiliating Treaty of Algiers of 1975, in which Iraq was forced to accept the middle of the Shatt al-Arab as the border between the two countries rather than the left bank. If there's agreement, however, on the use of the river, as there was, and if there was agreement on sharing expenses of dredging the river, as there was, it always has seemed to me irrelevant where the formal boundary is. Either side can close the river at will. The only difference is that if the river is all Iraqi, Iranian ships don't have to fly Iraqi flags when they come into the Shah. It's not terribly important. If you're worried about security, guns on the banks of the river can close the river at any time. Gun emplacements are not in the middle of the river. With the end of the war, there was no peace treaty because, among other things, the Iranians would not abandon the Treaty of Algiers. Furthermore, Iraq held several thousand square kilometers of Iranian territory. The money which was given to Iraq by Kuwait and Saudi Arabia was nominally loans. But I know of no Iraqi who thought the money would ever be repaid. If the subject came up, and it didn't very often, the Iraqi position was, we paid for this war with blood, we protected the Gulf states, and by God, they can pay for this with their dollars. In Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, there were also no illusions. They might have carried the debts on their books, but none, as far as I know, thought the money would ever come back. It just wasn't an issue. Iraq did have a grievance against Kuwait that wasn't pressed during the war. That is that Kuwait was producing from the very large Rumaila oil field, whose southern tip, about 5% of the reserves of the field, extended into the territory controlled by Kuwait. The Iraqis insist that by overproducing, the Kuwaitis drew oil into their section from the major part of the field. This just isn't true. The Kuwaitis were producing 25,000 barrels a day from their section, which is nothing. The field has reserves, it's one of the largest oil fields in the world. It has probably 15 billion barrels, and 25,000 barrels a day is nothing. In any case, the oil reserves of both countries are so large that the loss of a small proportion of oil in current production means absolutely nothing to the future development of the country, the future wealth of the country. The oil reserves of Kuwait are probably 70 billion, and Iraq well in excess of 100 billion. Much more important, however, was the Kuwaiti attitude toward oil prices. After the 79-80 oil crises, the oil prices jumped to about $40 a barrel. There wasn't any oil shortage, of course. There was, however, consumer panic. Consumers thought there was going to be a shortage. They went into the market. They bid up. They bid for the available oil, and the consumers, created the shortages, not OPEC. When it became obvious in a couple of years that the war would be contained, it wasn't going to spread, everybody in Japan whose bathtub was full of oil decided he better put this on the market. He had nothing to do with it. And suddenly, the prices of oil started to decline, and they dropped to $8 a barrel. This caused financial hardship in all oil exporting countries, including the richest of them. OPEC, however, finally got its act together. It worked out limits to production and tried to raise the price back to $18 a barrel, and it had some success. By 1988, every country in OPEC understood the consequences of allowing prices to go too high. No one talked of restoring the price to $38 a barrel, even in current dollars. The fact is that the consensus in OPEC was that the price should go back to $18, and then a gradual increase over a long period of time, 10 or 20 years, probably up to the cost of production of synthetics. It was a very benign position. There were, however, two mavericks in OPEC. One was Kuwait, which for reasons that are not entirely clear, decided that the price of oil should never be allowed to rise above $18 a barrel in current dollars for the remainder of the century. In other words, a continually declining price of oil for the next 10 years. The Kuwaiti oil minister, speaking in New York to the petroleum press just a year ago, said that if the price ever rose above $18 a barrel, Kuwait and Abu Dhabi would flood the world with oil and drive the price down to $18 a barrel. The Iraqis say, and they may believe, that Kuwait took this action at the behest of the United States, that both states aspired to destroy Iraq and Iran for good measure, that Kuwait would never have had the courage to have taken this extraordinarily hostile act toward Iraq on its own. I personally am sure that this is not true. There's no evidence of it, first of all, and I doubt very much that George Bush, whose personal fortune is based on oil, would want to keep the prices so low. But here, as elsewhere, perceived truth is more important than objective truth. The other culprit inside OPEC was Abu Dhabi, but it was motivated by greed. That is very clear. Both Abu Dhabi and Kuwait, and this is more important, however, both Abu Dhabi and Kuwait signed agreements with OPEC limiting production to bring the price back up. And three times, they broke their agreements. They produced substantially above their quotas, keeping prices several dollars a barrel below the target price. And this is the basis of the Iraqi claim against Kuwait, that by keeping the price low, they deprived Iraq of billions and billions of dollars. But it wasn't only Iraq that they irritated. It was all the other countries in OPEC. At the OPEC meeting in July, great pressure was placed on Kuwait and Abu Dhabi by Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Iraq. One must remember that. It wasn't just Iraq. Both of the countries were apparently shaken, and both agreed to honor their word, finally. The price of oil, all agreed, would be raised from $18 a barrel to $21 a barrel, kept there for a while to see what the effects in the market would be. And if a further increase were justified, then the price would be raised by another $2 a barrel, perhaps in a year or so, perhaps even longer. It was a very good agreement, and I thought there was a good chance that this time, OPEC would remain firm. No sooner, however, had the agreement been signed than Iraq announced that Kuwait was cheating once again. I was very worried about that, because it was assuredly not true. It was impossible that Iraq could have had evidence 2 days after the agreement that Kuwait was cheating. Things just don't go that fast in the Middle East. Subsequently, I learned from contacts I have in the Far East that Kuwait, what evidence there was exactly the opposite. Kuwait had told its customers in the Far East that for reasons of force majeure, they were reducing their deliveries to them by 25%. So the Iraqi statement of their cheating was really just untrue. And it was clear, at least it was clear to me, that Iraq was going to use this as a pretext to move against Kuwait. I assumed, as I think several others did that they would move into the islands that are of great interest to them. But of course, they moved farther. Right after the agreement, however, was signed, very strange stories circulated in the Middle East. I'm sure you've read them in the press. They're quite scurrilous. They attribute statements to Jabal Ahmed which are quite impossible. Jabal Ahmed is perhaps not the greatest ruler in the world, but he tends to be gentlemanly, and the statements that he is alleged to have said about Iraq are inconceivable. Not that he particularly liked Saddam Hussein, but the language that was used was not Jabal Ahmed's language. However, Iraq did do something that I find almost incomprehensible. They said, oh, by the way, as long as we're talking about money that we're supposed to owe you, you owe us $10 billion plus interest for the loans we gave you during the Iraq-Iran war. It was inflammatory. And given the tenseness of the moment, it was remarkably inastute of the Kuwaitis. 3 days after this statement, Saddam moved into Kuwait and the crisis began. Believers in the conspiracy theory, and they include some Americans, assert that the United States gave Iraq the green light to invade Kuwait. You've read the stories about the meetings between the ambassador in Baghdad and Kelly's statements here. And Saddam could well have concluded that the United States would not be particularly bothered by a move into Kuwait. But conspiracy, I mean, how does that fit? And what does the United States have to gain with such an action? Well, very simple. We tell Saddam that he can go into Kuwait, or at least we say we won't object to it. He moves into Kuwait. The Saudis are then frightened, and this gives us the chance to move our troops into Saudi Arabia, something we've been trying to do for the last 20 years. There isn't any evidence whatsoever that this is the American plan. And frankly, I'm again convinced that it's nonsense, for one reason. I just don't think Bush and Baker are that clever. However, there is no doubt that many of those who for years have urged the Saudis to allow stationing of American troops in their territory saw and seized a splendid opportunity once the Iraqi invasion took place. The United States responded immediately against the Iraqi aggression to the bewilderment of the Iraqis. They seem to have thought that the United States, having no great interest in Kuwait, would not mind this border adjustment. Furthermore, the Iraqis said repeatedly, and I thought rather plaintively, that the provocations from Kuwait were far more serious than the provocations to the United States from Grenada or Nicaragua or Panama. This, of course, illustrates the cultural poverty of Iraq. Having no classical education, they do not realize that quod licet Jovi non licet bovi, which loosely translated means what is permitted to the gods is not permitted to swine. How dare this Arab upstart think that his actions could be justified by actions taken by the United States? Kuwait is, of course, more important than our 3 Latin countries, although its population is smaller than Nicaragua's. Its oil reserves are very large, it's a rich country, and its absorption by Iraq clearly had to be reversed. As President Bush says repeatedly, this is intolerable. Iraq must withdraw from Kuwait, and on this he has the support of all Arab countries. The position taken by Jordan and Algeria and Yemen and the PLO have been consistently misrepresented in the United States, I presume deliberately. These countries in no way condone the invasion of Kuwait. All of their leaders, including Yasser Arafat, insist that Iraq must withdraw from Kuwait. But those countries thought, and this is the difference, that there could be, and indeed must be, an Arab solution to the problem. Others, led by Egypt and Saudi Arabia, favored bringing in outsiders, namely US, and we know who won. If there was some ambiguity about our interest in Kuwait, there was never any ambiguity about our interest in Saudi Arabia. President Carter said that Saudi Arabia was of vital interest to the United States, vital. An attack on Saudi Arabia would be considered an attack on the United States. This position was reiterated by President Carter's successor, whose name slips me, and by President Bush. Saddam knew this very well. I've never believed that Saddam intended to invade Saudi Arabia, never. He knew that it would bring him into instant war with the United States. And while he might have had some initial success, it is unlikely that he could have sustained long transportation lines across the desert from Basra through Kuwait to Riyadh or to Dammam. In any case, American bombers would quickly destroy Baghdad. It's impossible, of course, to know the innermost thoughts of someone else. Saddam is ruthless, but he is not irrational, and he is not suicidal. And a move into Saudi Arabia would have been both irrational and suicidal. If Saddam had intended to move, however, he certainly would have moved immediately before any Americans came into the Gulf. He might have thought that he could hold oil fields hostage to the United States, but he didn't move. He did move after Cheney went to Riyadh and convinced Fahad that an invasion was imminent. And he didn't move after the United States announced that it was sending troops to Saudi Arabia, which he knew he could not arrive immediately. Still, Cheney was persuasive. Fahad believed Cheney's evidence of an imminent Iraqi invasion and asked for American troops to come into the kingdom, and they came. What I don't know, and I hope to find out sometime before I die, is did Cheney himself believe that there was going to be an Iraqi invasion? I hope he did. I really do, because I would be extraordinarily pained if I thought that this was some giant scam that we were perpetrating on the Saudis. As I say, I have seen no evidence to lead me to this conclusion. Everything I know, at least deductively from the situation, leads me to conclude that there couldn't have been an Iraqi plan to invade Saudi Arabia. However, we came in to defend Saudi Arabia. That was the purpose. Then we came in to liberate Kuwait. Fine. Subsequently, the president said that we had to free the hostages held in Iraq and restore the Kuwait ruling family. Noble goals. However, there were informal press briefings, and everybody in this room, outside the country, outside Washington, they don't know this, but we know that real policy in Washington is revealed in the informal press briefings, not in the official press conferences. And these press briefings, quoting senior American officials, led many around the world to conclude that America's aims extended beyond these simple and rather unexceptionable goals. Iraq is clearly an important Arab country, the most important Arab country. Egypt has traditionally filled that role. Sorry, Ibrahim. But Egypt is a tiny country with an effective land area no larger than the Netherlands, and it has a population of 50 million, growing at 1 million every 7 months. Iraq has a population of 17 million, a lower growth rate. It has water resources and oil resources second only in the world to those of Saudi Arabia. The population is almost entirely literate. Israel very quickly recognized the danger of Iraq. It tilted toward Iran during the Iraq-Iran war. It brought the United States into the Iran arms scandal, and even George Shultz said that the Iran-Contra affair was an Israeli scam from the very beginning. Israel and its supporters here have led the campaign for an immediate war. Their concern is not Kuwait. Their concern is not even Saddam. Their concern is Iraq. Every one of their speeches, every article ends Cato-like with delenda est Baghdado. The Israeli position is based, I think, on a superficial understanding, or perhaps no understanding at all, of the Iraqis. Saddam has said repeatedly that Iraq is not a confrontation state. Everything agreed by the Palestinians, he has said, would be supported by him. It should be remembered that a year and a half ago, he was instrumental in persuading Arafat to accept our conditions for with regard to Israel. When they opened up the dialogue between the U.S. and the PLO, fruitless though they may have been. Still, Israel fears Iraq, and with some reason, as long as there is no peace. If there is peace, however, I find it hard to imagine that Iraq, a long way from Israel's borders, starting a war with Israel against the will of the neighboring Arab countries who are living in peace with Israel. The Iraqi dictator has been ruthless in dealing with his own people, Arabs as well as Kurds. But the Kurds have suffered particularly. Some of the Kurdish leaders threw their lot in with the Iranians in 1982, in the black early days of the Iraq-Iran war, after Iraq had been pushed out of Iran. A big mistake on their part, certainly. And when the war ended 6 years later, a terrible retribution was taken on all Kurds. The use of gas in Halabja, of the Kurds in Halabja, is not as clear or as unequivocal as current propaganda would have us believe. Nonetheless, that issue aside, the actions taken against the Kurds were terrible. All Kurdish villages were destroyed throughout Kurdistan. All Kurds were removed from an area 30 kilometers from the border with Iran. All Kurds have been concentrated in the main urban centers in Kurdistan and what amounts to concentration camps. One would be hard-pressed to find a Kurd who would have a good word to say for Saddam Hussein. And the Shia, who comprise 55% of the population, also felt depressed. Their religious leaders have been killed or exiled, and I would venture that the majority, perhaps the overwhelming majority of the Shia population of Iraq, would welcome an end to Saddam's regime. Nonetheless, during the Iraq-Iran war, particularly when Iraq appeared to be losing, the Shia and the Kurds in the army, and they are the overwhelming majority of the enlisted men, fought very well, not to protect Saddam, but to protect Iraq. And this is something we should remember before we begin our war against Iraq. The American and world reaction against the invasion of Kuwait was, I believe, quite proper. The demand that Iraq withdraw from Kuwait was just, regardless of the fact that borders were originally set by the imperial powers. This, after all, is true of Iraq itself, and it's true of most of the rest of Africa and Asia. Borders, once accepted, cannot lightly be changed. The call for sanctions and embargo on Iraq was quite proper. One of my personal quarrels with Saddam is that his invasion permitted the Bush administration and the Congress to eliminate the peace dividend, which we need for so many other reasons. No one in the Petroleum Club of Houston or in the boardrooms of Lockheed or Northrop would be so crass as to drink to the health of Saddam Hussein, but for them there is a particularly bright silver lining to this dark cloud. Oil prices doubled, and we're admonished by Washington lobbyists that there is real danger in the world out there, and we must be very careful not to disarm. And with the craven collapse of the Democratic Party, no weapons system was ended, not Star Wars, not the stealth bomber, nothing. And the Defense Department tried to convince us that the cut in the rate of growth in defense expenditures was the same as a cut in defense spending, and few objected. The Iraqis were shaken by the world action against them, in spite of the bravado that came out of Radio Baghdad. On the 12th of August, just 10 days after the invasion, the first crack showed. Saddam, in what I thought was a remarkable statement, said that the will of the people of Kuwait had to be determined. Secondly, he said he would withdraw from Kuwait provided the Israelis were to withdraw simultaneously from Arab lands that conquered in '67, and Israel and Syria would withdraw from Lebanon. The statement was interesting. There was no suggestion of the extermination of Israel. There was, in fact, an explicit recognition of Israel within its '67 borders. However, immediate withdrawal of Israel and Syria was clearly an impossibility. Saddam knew that. Equally clearly, he was opening the way to talks. The American reaction, however, was a curt and brutal dismissal of a silly and totally unacceptable proposal. There were two separate problems, we said. The Arab-Israeli problem and the Kuwait problem. There was no linkage, and there would be no linkage. How foolish. Other world leaders were much more perceptive. Gorbachev in Helsinki, with Bush, spoke about the necessity of addressing the basic Arab-Israeli conflict after the Iraqi withdrawal from Kuwait. Mitterrand, speaking at the UN, said the same thing. The Bush UN statement was consonant with those of Gorbachev and Mitterrand when he said that we would certainly have to address the Arab-Israeli problem, but immediately after the speech, he backtracked. It's one of the few instances where we have the president himself saying the president misspoke. Saddam followed his statement of August 12th with a similar statement made by his foreign minister in Amman some 10 days later. 2 weeks after that, Saddam said that we would certainly have to address the Israeli occupation of '67, but he said, we will not insist on a strict timetable. In other words, the two problems could be handled seriatim, not simultaneously. After the Mitterrand statement in the UN, there was an extremely positive reaction from Baghdad. Some 3 weeks ago, the Saudi defense minister also spoke about things that could be done after the Iraqi withdrawal from Kuwait. Remarkable statement from Prince Sultan. That is, the question of the oil field could be handled easily, and that's obviously true. And that as an act of brotherliness between Arabs, it would be reasonable for Kuwait to cede, or at least to lease, the islands that Iraq needs for the development of its port at Qasr. King Fahd made a very conciliatory statement, but neither the king's remark nor that of his defense minister sounded a very pleasing note in this town. And word was passed to Riyadh, and the king's next statement was very properly bellicose. Saddam Hussein, as we all know, is a monster. We won't even debate that question. But he's also an Arab. That can't be debated either. And he is a peasant. He's not a town Arab. He's from a tiny village outside Tikrit. Now, definitions of monsters may vary, and they may be quite subjective, but we know quite a lot about Arabs and peasants, and one of their strongest characteristics is an obsession with honor and dignity. These words have equivalents in Western languages, but in Arabic the meaning is rather more intense and rich. There's a venerable rule of diplomacy applying not just to Arabs. Never force your opponent into a position where he has no retreat. And we have ignored this in Iraq. Bush speaks of war crimes trials for Saddam and his henchmen. This implies only that there will be a war, that we will be victorious, that we will capture Saddam. Hardly means of enticing Saddam to compromise. If we wish to avoid war, Saddam must be allowed to withdraw from Kuwait with dignity and with his honor intact. We could allow this. I would not in any way suggest anything that Saddam could legitimately consider a victory. Nothing on the islands, nothing on the oil fields, and nothing on financial repayment. These could be properly left to negotiations between Kuwait and Iraq after the withdrawal. But taking statements which Saddam himself has made, there are three things I think we could offer. It wouldn't be called negotiations because Bush has resisted that word. The first is that we would support a UN-supervised plebiscite in Kuwait, as Saddam suggested on the 12th of August. Let the Kuwaitis decide whether they want union with Iraq, a return to the absolute monarchy of the past, a constitutional monarchy of '62, a new constitutional convention with limited monarchy, or a republic. Why not? This matter has been raised and has been rejected by President Bush, who has said Kuwait, of course, is not a democracy, but this is not a question of democracy, this is a question of legitimacy. This statement could have come out of the Congress of Vienna, but it's odd to read it on the lips of the President of the United States. We, after all, are the modern proponents of self-determination, the modern advocates of the rights of peoples to determine their own destiny. Yet President Bush says democracy cannot be considered in Kuwait. The sovereign must be restored. I wait anxiously for President Bush's pronouncements on the divine right of kings. This illustrates, I think, one of the problems of this war. How do we find a proper slogan? We have to have slogans for our wars. A war to make the world safe for feudalism. No, that doesn't have the right ring. The war for $1 a gallon gas. That's too materialistic. The war for a new world order. Well, that's better, but there's something lacking. And finally, Baker has come up, this is a war for jobs. My advice to George Bush is to call Peggy Noonan immediately. He needs her. Still, I digress somewhat. The Kuwaitis, however, on this point, I think have moved beyond us, and they themselves are talking about the restoration of the parliament, new constitutional convention. Furthermore, I'm not at all sure that Saddam would be too enthused about a plebiscite in Kuwait, no matter what he has said. Someone just might suggest free elections in Iraq. Still, it would be a place to start. The second offer is the real one and the most important one and the crucial one, and I think is to accept and advance the Gorbachev-Mitterrand proposal. That is, to commit ourselves to move toward a peace conference to settle the Arab-Israeli conflict and the implementation of all the outstanding UN Security Council resolutions on the Middle East, namely those on Jerusalem, the West Bank and Gaza, the Golan, and Lebanon. It's something Europe and the Soviet Union have talked about for a long time, and there hasn't been any such conference because we have blocked it. That Gorbachev and Mitterrand talk about this openly is not good enough. The United States is ultimately going to have to move in that direction if there's going to be peace in the Middle East, and if it were to do so now, it could have an immediate effect in Baghdad. And third thing we might offer, clearly the most difficult, would be to pick up the statement made by Saddam and Mubarak and Assad and King Hussein in Cairo in April of this year. That is, to make the Mideast a zone free of instruments of mass destruction, bacteriological, chemical, and nuclear, opening up to inspection by the UN of all such installations throughout the entire area. It would be difficult, of course, because we have tried for years without success to persuade Israel to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty and to open up its reactor at Dimona to inspection. Still, if there were real peace in the area between the Arabs and the Israelis, then perhaps Israel's reluctance to do this would change, or perhaps some other solution could be found. We could at least offer to start talking this subject after the withdrawal from Kuwait. Problem, of course, is that Saddam could well say, and would say, clearly would say, that he has accomplished something for the Arabs, and then he might withdraw from Kuwait. Again, perhaps it wouldn't work. We won't know until we try to find out. And we have made no effort to pursue these or any other points as far as I know. Saddam said on the 14th of November in an interview with Peter Jennings that everything was open to negotiation. Everything, he said. He wanted to talk with the Saudis, who were the key to the Arabs, and to the Americans, who were the key to the world reaction. And yet both still refuse. Why do we? What can we lose by talking with Saddam? In the meantime, the sanctions are working. Iraq is selling no oil. Its assets abroad are frozen. It's earning no money at all. It is broke. And no one is disposed to give it any long-term loans. Iraq is dependent on imports for spare parts for its military, almost entirely from France and the Soviet Union, and I doubt very much if they're giving them anything. And for its industrial establishment, this is also very difficult. Iraq also imports well over half of its calories, probably close to 3/4. Food may leak into Iraq, but it's unlikely that spare parts will be coming in. Sanctions cannot be totally effective immediately, obviously. We have to give them time. I would like to see us wait a year, ensuring through that time that sanctions are carefully observed. But we have now, it seems, gone beyond sanctions. Our announcement of raising troop levels in Saudi Arabia to 450,000 or thereabouts to give us the capability of launching an attack on Iraq makes it much more difficult for us to wait. It would indeed have been better had we formed a UN force at the beginning under the UN command with an American contingent, though not an overwhelming one. There could always have been an implicit or even explicit understanding that if Saddam were to attack the UN group or Saudi Arabia, the United States would be involved militarily with all of its power. Had there been such a force in Saudi Arabia today, say only 50,000 or less, plus perhaps American aircraft stationed in the kingdom, we could afford to wait much, much longer until sanctions are really hurting, and when there might be, and indeed would be, a greater possibility of changing the Iraqi position or changing the Iraqi government. According to Iraqis themselves, there have been 5 coup attempts this year already, all found out, all crushed, presumably all participants executed. The Army Chief of Staff has just been dismissed, and the rumors that I hear out of Baghdad is that he received a letter from retired officers asking him to, quote, do something, unquote, to avoid the disaster in which Saddam was leading the country. He made the mistake of not reporting the receipt of this letter to Saddam, and he was removed. He is out, and I presume he is also dead. Remaining officers are certainly concluding that no one is safe. Saddam's trusted advisors are now basically the members of his own family. The parallel with Ceausescu's Romania is startling. Still, we say we cannot afford to wait. We're impatient. American attention span is short. Henry Kissinger has said that the sanctions will fail, speaking ex cathedra. How he knows this has never been explained. But then he says, when it finally becomes obvious to everyone, not just to geniuses, that the sanctions have failed, the military option will no longer be viable. And why that must be true has also not been explained. His conclusion is clear. In order to avoid disaster, we must grasp the military option immediately, i.e., go to war against Iraq now. The General Dugan idea of destroying Iraq from the air, which is discredited by most competent military officers, is now being revived as the preferred option: destroy Iraq with the minimum of American casualties. What then will happen? Americans, I think, will almost surely have to move in on the ground. And the Iraqi army, by all military accounts, may not be terribly good at offense, but is remarkably efficient at defense. Tanks are dug in. There are gun emplacements throughout Kuwait and southern Iraq, which we'll have to face if we try to liberate Kuwait and occupy Baghdad. The Wall Street Journal suggests installing a new MacArthur in Baghdad, grand designs, to rule the country for the indefinite future. This would, of course, require many troops for a long time. Iraq learned in 1980 that in Iran, that a country near disintegration rallies around the government when attacked from outside. If our goal is to destroy Iraq and we try to invade the country, it is much more likely that the army will fight rather than surrender. It will not be Saddam they are defending, but Iraq. We must also address what would happen in Iraq if Saddam is allowed to withdraw from Kuwait with his dignity intact. Exactly 2 weeks ago today, I spoke at the Harvard Forum, and one of Kissinger's acolytes was there. He attacked the idea of allowing Saddam to save face as an absurdity. Why should we have a policy to allow Saddam to save his face? He said, our goal should be to humiliate Saddam. Of course, it is not our goal to allow Saddam to save face. Our goal is to try to avoid war. At least I hope that's it. And if Saddam saves face in the process, well, tant pis. His people will not look particularly kindly on him in any case, as he will have accomplished nothing for Iraq. The 8-year debacle in Iran ended with a great victory, as Saddam has said. But after he moved into Kuwait, he gave back to the Iranians every one of these magnificent gains, including the Shatt al-Arab. Iraq lost 300,000 men killed in the war, and the cost of the war to Iraq exceeded $200 billion. The Kuwaiti debacle has brought nothing but hardship to Iraq. No, I don't think Saddam will be particularly loved or admired, even though he can claim that he has brought America to the negotiating table for the Palestinians. We can, and will, say that this is something that we intended to do in any case when we were so rudely interrupted on the 2nd of August. In any case, it is something that we should have done a long time ago. Now, what about the bacteriological and chemical and nuclear weaponry of Iraq? How can we possibly not destroy Iraq, leaving them in this extraordinarily strong position? There are chemical weapons that we know. There may be bacteriological weapons because everybody in the world can make bacteriological weapons, but there are no nuclear weapons. Iraq's facilities are inspected regularly by the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is not to be dismissed entirely. And our own intelligence estimates vary. The most pessimistic one is that Iraq is 5 years from making a nuclear device. The others, and it seems to be the consensus, is about 10 years. One could say that about almost any semi-industrialized country in the world, 10 years from making a nuclear weapon. If they have the will and the money to finance it, almost anybody could do this. The technology is not arcane. But then what about the extraordinary dangers to the West and to us? If we don't destroy Iraq today, we'll have to do it in 5 years. You hear that in every single newspaper that you pick up. Many countries have nuclear weapons. Others are going to have them in the near future, or they could if they wish. Are we going to go to war with Pakistan when it has this bomb? It surely will soon, if it doesn't already. What about India? What about South Africa? What about Israel, after all? But let's try to examine these fears a little bit more calmly and try to be rational on this subject. Since 1945, we have contained the Soviet Union, a true superpower, at least in military terms, armed with not only chemical and bacteriological weapons, but with hydrogen bombs. We've contained China, more or less, for 40 years, a country with a population of 1 billion or more. Is it possible, really, seriously, to think that Iraq could not be contained by the European Economic Community, by the United States and the Soviet Union combined, even if Saddam Hussein survives? Iraq's population, after all, is only 17 million. The international community will be very careful about delivering anything to him that could be used for chemical and nuclear weaponry. And I doubt very much if engineers from Sheffield or Düsseldorf or Terre Haute are going to be going back to Iraq very soon, after what's happened to them in August. And Iraq needs foreign technicians. The danger of Saddam's survival seems emphasized against reason simply to justify a war of destruction today. Now, maybe, if we get through this without a war, some good will come out of this crisis. Perhaps there will be a new world order, as President Bush has suggested. If so, it could be salutary. What this new order means, as far as I can gather, is that it will henceforth be intolerable for small countries to attack other small countries. Now, if uniformly applied, that's not bad. It could be very good. I wonder, however, if it has already failed. I have read about Rwanda being invaded, but really has it? I'm not exactly sure where Rwanda is, and I'm not really sure that I care. I do know that there is no oil there, however. But more to the point, would this new world order stop another Israeli invasion of Lebanon as in 1982? We don't even need to discuss whether it would inhibit the Soviet Union in Afghanistan or China in Tibet or the United States in Grenada or Panama. Could it even force the United States to abide by World Court rulings on Nicaragua? All clearly impossible. Nonetheless, it would be a good step in the right direction, and perhaps morality enforced on small countries will be a model for larger countries to emulate. There can be no question that Saddam will leave Kuwait. If he doesn't withdraw voluntarily, he will be forced out by war. And if there is a war, his cities will be devastated, his infrastructure will be destroyed, and quite possibly his country will be dismembered, even if that is not the current American plan. If we move militarily into Iraq, we will suffer significant casualties. We will be supported by none of our traditional allies, excepting, of course, England, and that assumes that Mrs. Thatcher will survive. The United Arab Phalanx we so proudly constructed will not survive an Arab attack on Iraq. Its two most prominent members, Syria and Egypt, have announced that they are there to protect Saudi Arabia from attack, not to invade Iraq. We will eventually win, but what then? What will be our position in the Middle East, or in the Third World as a whole? We might be asked to stay on indefinitely in the Arabian Peninsula as the guardians or the mercenaries of the ruling families. But how long would even that survive? And who then will be the dominant power in the Persian Gulf? Saudi Arabia? Not bloody likely. It will be the Iranian mullahs who frightened us so badly in 1979. Who then is the war party here in this country? Apart from Israel and its supporters, it's the ruling family of Kuwait and part, but by no means all, of the Saudi ruling family. Is that enough? One must take care in Washington and elsewhere to avoid saying, if only you had followed my good advice in the beginning, you wouldn't have gotten into this terrible fix. You don't win friends and influence people that way, even though you're right, especially if you're right. The only thing that I can advise now is that we not rush into war, that we give the sanctions a chance to work, and that we offer Saddam an honorable retreat. I wouldn't advise the president to withdraw troops from Saudi Arabia now. The Mideast and beyond, without any doubt, would interpret that as a mighty victory for Saddam, and it would indeed be much more difficult to deal with him in the future. It would also mean the end of George Bush's political career. Now, some of you may consider that a positive accomplishment, but I'm sure George Bush would not. Under present circumstances, withdrawal just doesn't seem worthy of discussion. To put it in the local vernacular, it's not a viable option. Congress is feckless. It is highly unlikely that it will take any action to force withdrawal. In fact, if it comes to a vote, I'm sure the majority will get cold feet and will back Bush in anything he does. I've been asked several times recently if I didn't think the likelihood of an attack on Iraq was receding. I do not. I read the polls, I hear statements from some congressmen, and I know that the initial aggressiveness is fading as Americans consider the consequences of the war. But I also read the constant warnings from columnists that the Iraqi potential for war must be destroyed now. In a few years, it will be much more difficult. And I read statements by military commentators, but rarely by military officers, that the Iraqi army is grossly overestimated and that the destruction of Iraqi military and economic targets will be easy. There will be few American casualties, and not very many Iraqi casualties either. It's part of what I call the Tom Clancy syndrome. American technology always works. This is ominous. The prospect of a quick and easy victory is seductive to politicians. What if this is true? George Bush will be asking himself. If it is, I go to war. That is, I exercise my military option, and the danger from Iraq is ended forever. More important, the image of George Bush, the wimp, is finally laid to rest, and I will be re-elected in '92 with a great majority. It's heady stuff. One pressing task that I've taken on myself is to try to create doubts in the mind of George Bush. If we decide to go to war, if we decide the sanctions have failed or that we simply cannot wait or will not wait any longer, it will be easy to fabricate an incident, an excuse to start the bombing of Baghdad. And once we are fighting, the country, as always, will rally around the flag. I have no doubt whatsoever that the Congress will vote overwhelming support for Bush and the polls will show 80% approval, but not for long. When the first body bags come in, when the first photographs of the devastation of Iraqi cities appear on American television, the reaction will begin. Then, of course, it will be too late. Like most Americans, I am inherently optimistic, excepting, of course, when I deal with the Middle East. My third law of Mideast politics is that in any rational conflict between an optimistic prognostication and a pessimistic one, the pessimistic is always right. And I don't think that the current crisis will prove an exception to the rule. But I also know in my heart and my belly that we Americans don't really have anything to worry about. That Bismarck was right when he said that God has a special dispensation for drunkards, fools, and the United States of America. Yes, I tell myself everything will work out in the end. No serious harm will come to the Republic. Unfortunately, this requires an act of faith that doesn't come as easily now as it did 30 years ago. Maybe God will lose his patience with us. Maybe he already has. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these, to say the least, thought-provoking remarks. The floor is now open after our usual custom for your brief comments or questions for Ambassador Akins, and he will take the questioners as he sees it. Please identify yourself when you speak.
I'm Joe Storr. With all the sort of advice that you've laid out, and there's every reason to believe that people in top levels of the Bush administration have been hearing this from within their own ranks.
There isn't any such evidence at all. I really don't think so.
You don't think there's the debate going on?
No, I don't think there is any. Excuse me, but go on.
Okay.
Yeah.
They've been hearing it then from the outside at the very least. And there are all sorts of cautionary reasons why they should not proceed. And one could spend another half hour outlining another whole list.
Sure.
What is going on? What sort of calculus are they making to cast all this to the wind, to take the risks that are involved? It seems to me that with Bush's announcement last week, he's essentially, in Tom Schelling's analogy, thrown the steering wheel out the window and said, I don't care about the polls, I don't care about the international environment, I'm going ahead, Saddam, and you'd better get out of the way. What's the basis for this calculation, since there's so much to lose?
The only thing that I can conclude is that Bush and his advisors have convinced themselves that the war will be quick and easy, relatively few American casualties. I can't reach any other conclusion, can you?
But they seem to be getting other advice on this as well.
I don't think they are. I don't think they are. Have you been consulted by the administration?
I have not.
I asked, yeah, I just wondered. Do you know of any Arabist, any person who knows anything about the Middle East outside the government who's been consulted?
But this is not a question for Arabists. This is a question for military.
No. That's true to a large extent, yes. But if you're going to move into the area, you have to know about some of the people that you're fighting. How are they going to fight? One of the parts of the easy scenario is that the first bullet is fired and the Iraqis drop their guns and run home.
That's one scenario, but I do think there are others being advanced. We see them laid out in the media.
True. But is there any evidence that these reports are being believed or accepted by the people in the administration?
Well, let me frame it a little bit differently then. What advice are they getting from their Arab allies, from the Saudis and the Egyptians on this question?
That I don't know. I don't know. Some of the Saudis obviously want a war. The Saudi ambassador in Washington clearly does. What Arabs are they listening to? Are they really listening to the Arabs? They certainly aren't listening to King Hussein. What about the Algerians? Are they listening to them? I doubt it. Syrians, I suppose, don't count. Egypt does count. But I have no idea what advice Mubarak is given. Mubarak has said, however, that I will not participate in the war. I will not invade Iraq. They should have noted that. They can't miss that statement. Yes.
It's been repeated my name is Andrew Kober. It's been repeated a great number of times that Israel is keeping a low profile in this crisis and that the administration is grateful for that. Do you in fact think that Israel has, in the communications that can, been keeping a low profile in this crisis?
Well, very definitely. They are not rattling sabers. They are not bombing anyone. They are doing relatively nothing. We have asked them not to do anything, of course. It's the question, I suppose, is not have they maintained a low profile up to now. They have, but will they continue to do so? And that I'm not so sure either. Or will Saddam decide that he's going to bring Israel into the war? This is one of the nightmares that we must have.
I could refer back to the previous question in terms of who the administration is talking to. Are the Israelis, in fact, in private communications with the administration? Do you see evidence of a large Israeli input on the thinking and planning that's going on in the White House?
Well, it certainly seems to me that that's the case, but I can't say I have any evidence of it. I mean, I can't say that on the 2nd of November they met with Moshe Arens, for example. I just don't know. We know the way they're acting, and it appears they appear to be following the Israeli advice. Yes.
Mr. Ambassador, you said that you don't support the idea of troops withdrawal at this point, and you gave your good reasons. But what do you suggest that should be done from there? Are you suggesting one of your 3 scenarios, or do you have a different agenda for that? And please state again, and very briefly, what are the objectives of the Bush government for this whole thing if it is not oil? Is it only just to wage a war for the sake of war, or are there some other good reasons?
You know the statements made by Bush, the things he hopes to accomplish. It's been repeated so often that it's become a cliche, but nonetheless, sometimes cliches are true too. I doubt very much if we would have had great interest in Kuwait if their exports had not been oil. If someone said carrots and others said bananas, we would not be that interested in Kuwait. Oil is obviously extraordinarily important in this equation. And of course the administration has said that. They said that, and this was Baker's statement, we cannot allow such a high proportion of the world's oil, that is Iraq and Kuwait, to be ruled by a person as nasty as Saddam Hussein. Oil is certainly a factor in this. I'm not sure if you're getting at are we planning to be a permanent occupier of the Saudi oil fields? I hope not. I don't think that would work. No matter if the Saudi government were to ask us to stay indefinitely, I think the Saudi army and the Saudi people ultimately, in fact fairly quickly, would turn against our presence in the country. I don't know if we're going to withdraw immediately after the crisis is over. You've heard the statements also from the Defense Department saying that we're going to be there for a long time. 10 years has been mentioned. It's a long time to have a military presence in that area, and I think that it would be extremely difficult for us to sustain. You know, I doubt very much if they worked out very carefully what their long-term goals are for Saudi Arabia. Have they really made plans for a permanent occupation of this? There are a lot of people in the area who do, and not only in the area. The joke in Vienna is that the United States is now the 14th member of OPEC. There are others who say, no, that's not true. It's the 12th member of OPEC because Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE are no longer members of OPEC. In any case, as far as Saudi oil policy that they're following today is certainly pleasing to the United States, no question about that. They've increased their production dramatically. They have advanced their expansion plans dramatically, and but they presumably are doing this. They could be doing this just as easily on their own. If when this new expansion plan is in place, we will be able to dispense with the total Iraqi and Kuwaiti production forever. Well, not forever, but for the indefinite future. Yes.
Concerning advice the administration might be getting, if one reads foreign press, as opposed to how the reporting in our press comes out, where whatever anybody else says within the coalition from the UN, Security Council, for instance, it's always ended by saying, after all, those words mean exactly what we are saying, but obviously the words are different. There does not seem to be a national editorial recognition that all the trips that especially Baker has been making, and not only once, he just keeps traveling. He comes home for a clean shirt and he goes out again. He hears messages that are in effect avoiding or trying not to consider war as a possibility, as a immediate possibility. But he keeps at it. And this issue of jobs, which really struck me as inane, but it may have some rationality, either in Bush's mind or in Baker's mind. They're now rotating 2 divisions from West Germany, from New Germany, United Germany, to the Middle East. Instead of bringing them home, they're rotating them to the Middle East on the way of bringing them home. If they brought them home now as surplus army personnel, you would have an increase in unemployment, clearly. And if there is anything else that does not work out the way the White House is expecting, that is support on the basis of the Iraqi crisis for this huge Defense Department budget, which again is inane, and you mentioned that the Democrats in the Congress simply didn't follow through with what only several months ago they said it's a fait accompli. We're going to cancel 2, 3, 4 major new arm production series. The fluidity of the whole situation is such that you mention it, we had it before in Vietnam, we had it repeatedly in Nicaragua. If the administration is hell-bent on doing what they put themselves in a corner as far as not being able to get out, they can fabricate any excuse, and then hell will break loose.
That's exactly what I said. To have an excuse to start the war is the easiest thing in the world. Easiest thing. Yes.
Gene Bird, 2 questions. One, would you comment on the response of Saddam Hussein to the president's escalation by escalating himself today, 250,000 more troops in there, and our further response today, which is unexplainable to me, revealing this, if we do have this in mind, that we may have to stay for years with 100,000 troops in Saudi Arabia. Finally, would you think that there's any chance that a combination of Arab and European and Soviet statesmen, shall we say, get together and force us to go the international conference route for the Middle East on a long-term basis?
Well, on the first part, the escalation by the Iraqis certainly should have been foreseen by the administration. I don't think that bothers them very much. I hadn't heard about our statement of keeping 100,000 troops in the Arabian Peninsula for indefinitely. I'm sure that must delight the Saudi government to hear that. And I doubt very much that's what King Fahd had in mind when he issued the first offer for the Americans to come in. You know, there are a lot of ways you could look at this. If we really have decided that we don't want to go to war, I don't think we have, but if we decide we don't want to go to war and we don't want Saddam to do anything, we apply the sanctions, keep the sanctions up indefinitely, and then we go our merry way. And we can have 100,000 troops to make sure that Saudi Arabia isn't attacked, keep a big air force in Saudi Arabia or not far away. And the Saudi oil reserves are tremendous. And as I said, in a very short time, by 1992, Iraq and Kuwait can be replaced completely by additional Saudi production. I don't think that's anybody's plan, but I suppose somebody could be thinking about it.
Comment on the following.
Oh, excuse me. The second question. Yeah, that's what I hope will happen, of course. Obviously, that's implicit in what I said. Everybody in the world wants us to do this. Why don't we do it? What do we have to lose by doing it? It's something that we know very well that the Arab-Israeli conflict is the main political problem in the Middle East, and it's got to be solved sometime. Everybody wants to move on this. The Europeans have pushed this, the Russians have, even the Japanese. And we haven't done it. Why shouldn't we? And it'd be very nice if the Europeans, including Mrs. Thatcher, would push us on this. Yes.
Your comment on Larry King 2 nights ago, Ambassador Wiley was hinting or comparing the invasion of Kuwait to the invasion of Israel to Lebanon. Larry King asked him immediately whether he was anti-Israel, and Deputy Netanyahu said, Lebanon is not a country. It was already broken up.
Yeah.
So,
Well, yes.
And can we afford this war?
Well, I think I've answered that. I think it would be a catastrophe for us. We cannot afford it.
You mentioned that if a war was to break up and if the U.S. was to attack Iraq,
Could you speak up?
Okay, you mentioned that if the U.S. was to attack Iraq, regardless of what's going to happen to Saddam, the Iraqi people or the Iraqi army will fight to defend Iraq, not Saddam, because also you said that Saddam is a monster, and it sounds like if he became a monster the day he invaded Kuwait, well, we know that he was a monster.
Quite right.
Even at the time when he was a friend to the West, including the U.S.
Well, we're friendly with lots of monsters.
Okay, we agree on that. Now, if the war was to break up, and as you said, the Iraqis will defend Iraq, how does this fit with the American values and principles of freedom and democracy and human rights and civil rights and all that list?
Nothing, of course.
Well, how? I mean,
it has nothing to do with
how is it? Of course it does. How is the U.S.
and rarely does
to justify to its public opinion if the Iraqis will be defending Iraq and not Saddam?
Mm-hmm.
What would be the answer?
Well, we've already said this. Bush has made that very clear. This is a terrible act of aggression and has to be rolled back, and the aggressor has to be punished.
Yeah, but forget about Saddam. I'm talking about Iraq, not Saddam.
Oh yes, but how do you punish Saddam without punishing Iraq? That's the problem.
Yeah, but the Iraqi people will be defending Iraq, not Saddam.
Of course.
Don't you see any contradiction here?
Of course I do. And I guarantee you this is the way it's going to be looked at throughout the Arab world. We don't know anything about Iraq. We don't know what the situation is. As far as we're concerned, 99.9% of the Iraqi people support Saddam, just as the elections say. Yeah. But every Arab knows that that's not true. Every Arab knows that Saddam is supported by a tiny fraction of his people. And when the people of Baghdad and Mosul and Basra and Karbala and Najaf and Samara are killed, these are going to be people who hate Saddam, and every Arab is going to know that. And this is something that we're going to have to carry with us for a long, long time. But have they thought about that here? Oh, I doubt that very much. No. Yes.
So I have a question regarding the Gulf region itself. Let us suppose that there is a war. What are the positive and negative impacts, politically, socially, and economically, of that region, the region itself? What do you think of it?
Of a war?
Yeah.
I suppose it depends on how it proceeds. If there's a if there's a quick destruction of the Iraqi offensive military capabilities, then they probably will escape physical damage. Maybe a few missiles will hit Riyadh or maybe Dammam, but maybe not with luck. So they might be able to escape physical damage altogether. But what about the other consequences? The political consequences of having their countries used as a base to destroy another Arab country. You know, these are very important questions. There may have been important changes in Arab thinking. I find it difficult myself to accept that. But we hear reports from newspapermen who come back who say that Arabism is dead. We're no longer Arabs. Israel is not our enemy. Iraq is our enemy. The idea of working together in the Arab world is finished. There is no such thing as the Arab League. Forget about it. We may be Muslims, but Arabs, no, we're going to have some new definitions. I find that very difficult to accept.
Who's saying that?
Pardon?
Who's saying that? I mean, the reporters going there and asking people, who are these people?
Exactly right. Precisely. Who are they? Are they representative? This is the question I'm asking myself. I read some of these reports, and I've read so many of them daily. You have a new report about correspondent X, correspondent Y, correspondent Z in Saudi Arabia, in the Emirates, and even in Egypt, all saying the same thing. Arabism is dead. We cannot any longer talk about the Arab world. These are outmoded concepts. You've read them, I'm sure, yourself. I find that myself personally extremely hard to accept as true, but I'm not dismissing it totally. It is just conceivable, I suppose, that this has happened. I have a very good Arab friend, Ghazi Ghuseibi. I'm sure many of you know his name, and I've always considered him an extraordinarily astute, honorable Arab nationalist, basically. And I'm sure that a lot of you have read the articles that he's been publishing in the last 2 months. And if Ghazi Ghuseibi thinks things like that, I really do have to take it seriously. Arabism is dead. Extraordinary attacks on Jordan and the Palestinians and the Yemenis and so on. I don't know what the ultimate political effect is going to be on the area. I find it very difficult to imagine. I sat down last week and tried to draft a paper on what the area will be like after the war, assuming that we win the war, that is, Iraq is destroyed. And I came up with nothing that gave me any joy at all, nothing. Maybe you could come up with something.
I was having some questions, but let me comment on the last point that you have said about Ghazi Ghuseibi and the question of Arab nationalism and Arab unity and so on and so forth. I don't think that it died, and I don't think that it has gone. This is something that I think it's rooted way in history.
I feel that too.
Yeah, but the question is, what has happened is actually has led to some questions to be asked. Things has been taken for granted and so on and so forth. You can write a big essay about that. People now asking real question. Unity based on what and so on and so forth, but the genuine aspect of unity and nationalism probably as strong as it is before. What Ghazi was writing, I can tell you, coming from the area, that there is a lot of people who disagree with Ghazi.
Really?
But Ghazi has his own opinion, and probably he has lost some of his supporters. Let me go back to the issue. I want to add just another dimension to what you said against the war. The dimension of if a war erupts, I guess it will inflict a deep sadness, conflict, and trouble amongst the Arab world, amongst the Arab people themselves. And I underline the question of people. Now, we've been having wars and fights and so on and so forth amongst Arab governments for the last many, many years. But that doesn't matter, because none of any government represents its people over there. And the people have been always insulated and isolated from this conflict, and government comes in and government goes back, and, you know, the people are the same and their feelings are the same. I mean, good example is the war between Egypt and Yemen and Saudi Arabia many years ago, and so on and so forth. Now, the special thing about this war, it has really cut down into divergence of people. And if the war erupts, I guess the feelings of the people from a social point of view is going to be with Iraq. Iraq, not Saddam. Iraq, the people. Iraq, the culture. Iraq, the country. So whoever is going to fight, the United States, you will find a lot of people, they may hate Saddam, and they don't want his guts, but they will never, and they don't want to see an Arab country, an Arab brother, destroyed or killed. Whether they're Saudis, whether they're Kuwaitis, or anything like that. Maybe at a moment of anger, they wanted to see Saddam Hussein, but really launching a war and destroying a country, destroying a people, it will leave the United States with a bad asset to carry on for many years to come. Now, having said this, I go back to the original question, is that Saddam is not an asset to be kept. We're not happy about him. I don't think that he's, in terms of the question of democracy and freedom and so on and so forth, they're all probably bad, but he's the worst. And the question is, really, nobody agrees with him, agrees with what he has done. And especially he has opened a new chapter by i.e. a strong government, a strong Arab military power could really invade another. And that will lead us to a spiral of destabilization, which aside from military revolution, now it has opening a new chapter. You don't revolt against your government, but you can go and occupy another country. That's a chapter we don't need. We have so many disasters in our region, and we want to go to stability. Now, if Saddam Hussein, the other paradox, the one paradox is the war, the other paradox, if Saddam Hussein wins one way or another, and to me the definition of winning from a quantitative point of view, i.e. not leaving Kuwait. I don't care who comes after, it's right, the legitimacy of the people, that's not equal. Just leaving Kuwait and going back to his borders. If he doesn't do that, I guess this is another dangerous, from an internal point of view, is as dangerous as the war itself. Now, the sanctions hopefully to work, but you did not tell us, let's say, if the sanction does not work, and if we say there 1 year and 2 years it doesn't work, where do we go? Is your ultimate solution is the war, or what?
I'm assuming there's going to be a war if Saddam does not withdraw from Kuwait. And all I have suggested is that we take time for the sanctions to hurt Iraq, and that we give him a face-saving way out. If that doesn't work, there will be a war. It's going to have the same disastrous consequences that I've talked about and you've talked about. No question about that. But I don't think there's any debate on this issue. He is going to get out of Kuwait. He will get out of Kuwait on his own, or there will be a war and he will be driven out. No question about that. There is one point that I raised that I would like to get your views on, because it bothers me. I said that I would not advise, in fact I would advise against the withdrawal of American troops from Saudi Arabia today. I would like very much to get your views on that statement.
That was my question. You said there were 3 ways to do this. Like, for instance, we run a plebiscite in Kuwait, or have an international peace conference, or disarmament as a way to move things in the region. Was that your idea behind leaving the troops there?
No, that's not the question. You're addressing something else I said. I'm saying that given the troops that we have now in Saudi Arabia, I think that if I said in the talk that if we were to withdraw these troops, it would be seen in Iraq and elsewhere as a victory for Saddam, and that Saddam thereby would be strengthened, and therefore it is something that we really cannot consider. I feel somewhat uneasy about that statement, and I want your views on that statement. What do you think? No, you.
What do I think?
Yes. You have a view. I know you have a view.
I think that, let me put it this way. What if there were a partial withdrawal with a statement that the president was simply reaffirming his original and quite limited 4 points, and that after consultation with his various allies, Arab and international and congressional, it seemed more credible to maintain our determination to reduce the force somewhat for the reason that you mentioned, that we can afford to stay longer. And in fact, we would stay longer, and that would be your peaceful solution.
And obviously, if he decides to withdraw, he's going to have to find some rationale for it, and that, I suppose, it would have to be something like that. But you didn't answer the question. Assuming that's done, what will be the reaction in the Middle East?
But the problem is, even keeping the
somebody
forces...
else's answer.
If the, I think it depends who you're asking in the Middle East, but I think a lot of people in the Arab world, both perhaps friends but perhaps adversaries of ours, would very much hope that anything that can be done to reduce the possibility of a major war, which is going to lead, I fully agree with you, to unpredictable but probably generally catastrophic results, is something not something to welcome, and therefore they ought not to gloat too much at the withdrawal of part of an American force. So I'm not so sure that it would be an unadulterated victory, political victory in the region for Saddam Hussein.
Would you therefore advise Bush to withdraw some of the troops?
I would advise to, at least in the short instance, to sit tight, but I think a redefinition of our aims, and indeed a contraction of the aims, since they have blossomed beyond their original formulation, would be a wise thing to do. And I think that the results, while not a particularly happy ending, because in a way we've blundered, at least would not be as catastrophic as what is most probably going to happen.
Sorry. One question to the...
Tony Khater, Ambassador, about your, I mean, you've said that you would not, and that's what you feel uneasy about, you would not advise that President Bush pull out troops at this stage. And you're probably right. I think most of the country is going to feel, probably shares in your feelings. Pulling troops out at this stage will be perceived definitely as American weakness or an American defeat of sorts. I honestly believe that if one leaves wishful thinking aside, and I think Dr. Hudson may be in the camp of somewhat wishful thinking, I think war is inevitable at this stage. I think the initiative is in Saddam Hussein's hand. If he pulls back now from Kuwait, we will be left empty-handed, and he stays in the oil fields, Rumaila oil fields, and a couple of islands, we will lose the consensus somewhat, which is really not so much of the consensus that we have. So the initiative is in Saddam Hussein's hand, and it's up to him to use it whichever way he wants to. I mean, the thing, though, that the scary, the nightmarish scenario is the following, that there will be an Iraqi-American war, and then that we will win that war, and there will be a Pax Americana in the area, financed completely by the Saudi budget, meaning we're going to have to imbue Syria and Egypt with money in order to avoid a takeover by the Islamic Brothers in Egypt or a takeover by some sort of Sunni-led opposition in Syria, because Syria, after all, the consensus that exists in Syria is not one based on slaughtering people in Hama or wherever. It's also based on a dynamic of confrontation with Israel. If that dynamic is lost, then Syria, the regime, is lost. But if we imbue billions of dollars into the Syrian economy and the Syrian regime, maybe that regime will stay, maybe the Mubarak regime will stay. So I see that war is inevitable unless Saddam Hussein withdraws, and I see that the new peace will be a Pax Americana with a lot of money, financed solely with Saudi money. The Europeans will be out.
I don't know how many optimists or pessimists there are. I think the pessimists and skeptics clearly are in the majority. I think, though, that we're coming really past the end of our time, and if Ambassador Akins would like to take perhaps one more question, I actually would like to ask it, and I'll exercise the right of the chair to do so. And the question is a kind of an action-oriented question. I share the generally skeptical and pessimistic analysis that you have made, and I think most probably war is more likely than peace. Assuming, however, that I think many of us agree that a diplomatic solution is preferable for many reasons, the question simply is, what steps do you think might be effective and still reasonably feasible given the domestic situation here and the international situation toward moving a diplomatic process forward?
Mm-hmm. Well, clearly we have to start the talks. As I referred to Saddam's interview with Peter Jennings, he said we have to talk to the Saudis, we have to talk with the Americans, they refuse to talk to us. That's the first step. Obviously, you can't talk about things if you don't meet the people that you're supposed to be negotiating with. I said repeatedly in the paper that there will be war unless Saddam withdraws, and he's not going to withdraw, I think, unless he's given some face-saving device. And maybe there are others than the three that I mentioned, but the three that I mentioned were all, I tied them all to things that Saddam himself has said. I don't think this would be too difficult for the United States to accept. I would hope not. If we offered them to Saddam Hussein, say that we're prepared to do all three steps, or one, or two, or three, or all three of them, or something else that I haven't thought of, and then he says, no, they're not good enough, I'm not going to withdraw, then there's no question there's going to be war, but we will at least have made an effort to allow him to get out with his honor intact. I think this is the important thing. If we're going to say, as we're saying now, war crimes trials, he must withdraw, finish, that's all, basta. He must withdraw, he must put his tail between his legs, and he must withdraw and be humiliated, as Kissinger says. Our goal should be to humiliate Saddam Hussein. This is it's not a formula for a peaceful solution. I don't know whether the Bush administration is willing to allow Saddam to save his face. Maybe they aren't. Maybe the people they're listening to are saying it's important to humiliate him, and he will withdraw, he will be humiliated, and then he will be finished. But I don't think Saddam is looking at it quite in those terms. But I am blackly pessimistic about this as well. I think that we won't make the offer. We won't make the offer, Saddam, to allow him to save face. He will not withdraw. And then we will have war. And the consequences are very difficult to outline.
Well, apart from the substantive issues, and despite your black pessimism, may I follow up about possible modalities? Mm-hmm. That is to say, given you've mentioned, for example, that the war party is rather small, actually. Mm-hmm. If you look at the Israelis, you look at a part of the Saudi government, you look at the Kuwait government in exile, and you look at some columnists. Mm-hmm. In the region, of course, there are many people, and we've mentioned the Soviets and the French, among others, some Arab parties that have tried to carry the diplomatic ball. Now, say we have, maybe we have, who knows, a month, 2 months, 3 months before war breaks out for one reason or another. Are there any concrete initiatives by any of these parties, or in the case of those opposed to the war parties, initiatives that can be taken or coalitions that can be formed?
To persuade the United States to alter its position?
And, of course, to persuade Saddam to alter his position in Kuwait.
Well, an awful lot of people are saying that he has to withdraw. I think just about everybody in the entire world is saying that. So I think the important action has to be taken here, not in Baghdad. That is, Washington has to be convinced that it has to allow him a face-saving way out. He knows that he has to withdraw. I think he knows he is going to withdraw, but he wants to withdraw with his head held high. And if we say no, it has to be bowed, then there's going to be war. Now, can the French, can the Russians convince us that their proposal to have a Middle East peace conference is extremely important? That Bush should associate himself with this and say that perhaps he doesn't even need to send somebody out to Baghdad. He can just announce, yes, our policy, as soon as there's the withdrawal from Kuwait, this is what we're going to do in the Arab-Israeli conflict. Saddam might say, or could grasp at this straw as, I finally accomplished this. I've gotten the Americans to do something that nobody else has done, and now I'm prepared to withdraw from Kuwait. It's possible. I would think it'd be better, however, to send somebody out to Baghdad and explore it with him. People have said you can't suggest sending Baker out. Of course not. Send somebody out who is expendable, who can be denied. But the country is, the city is full of people like that. You, me, others, Joe Stork, President Carter. He's more difficult to deny, however.
Well, I'd like to, on behalf of all of us, thank Ambassador Akins for a very sober